Hi and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector, and today this is a kind of hybrid video. We're going to talk about a science fiction novel, Beautiful Star by Yukio Mishima. We're also going to talk about Mishima in a more general sense, and I may do more videos about him because he is somebody I've been reading since I think it was 84, 85, I think it was 85, and it may be earlier because I first discovered Mishima in 1978 when he was the subject of a song by my favourite rock and roll band of all time, the Stranglers, and on their third album, which came out in March 1978 and which is now widely regarded as the first post-punk album, and that's a view which is coming on board more and more. And even then it was obvious that something was happening because punk was coming to an end because Sid Vicious died and things had really changed. And on this album, and this is a Japanese version of the album, this is a little mini LP card CD, as you see, with a little OB. This is black and white, and there's a song on black and white called Death and Night and Blood, open brackets Yukio, close brackets Yukio. And Death and Night and Blood was a song which J.J. Bennell, the bassist, who is squatting down in the corner there, you can just see him behind the OB, he wrote because he was obsessed with Mishima. And all great rock and roll bands come with a reading list, and that's how I discovered him. And I don't think I actually read him till later on, but I'm uncertain because my oldest Mishima book is a copy of Confessions of a Mask, which is stuck in a box under a bed, and because I'm not 100% at the moment, I can't really go crawling for boxes because things are so inaccessible. But I'll flash up a picture of it on the screen, and it's an old sort of Granada A format, but this is a Peter Owen hardcover reissue. This is from, I think, the 90s, and Peter signed this for me because I knew Peter, who was Mishima's hardcover publisher when he was alive. He's no longer with us. I had quite a few dealings with him in the 90s. And really, it was fascinating, the song. And if you want to see some of my Japanese CDs, I may well do a little collection video about those, so do let me know if you're interested. We are getting back on track, I promise. So Mishima was somebody I heard about through rock and roll and then read within the next few years. And my copy of Confessions of a Mask is, I'll flip it up on the screen, and as you'll see in it, it's a colour photograph of Mishima in the attitude of Saint Sebastian after he was pierced by the arrows tied to the trees. And Saint Sebastian, strangely, somehow has become a gay icon. So I don't know enough about hagiography, the history of saints, to really go into that. I'm sure somebody will tell me, and I know I've read up on it, but I'm not going to try and go from memory now. But yeah, Confessions of a Mask was Mishima's first book. He was born in 1925 into a sort of samurai family, and his grandmother kind of took him away from his parents and raised him in a sort of very sort of severe environment. And he was a real child prodigy, and he was an absolute genius, incredible writer and a fascinating man, and you can't really get away from that. And recently my good friend Matt at Book Pilled read Decay of the Angel, which was the final novel that Mishima published in his lifetime, and we'll come back to that. And Matt talked a bit about how brilliant the writing was, and Matt, like me, loves Mishima. He's only read 2 books by him. The first book I know Matt read by him was this, The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, and I think I might have read this before Confessions because they were both a long time ago, and that's my lovely original King Penguin. I'm just going to check the date on that for you. Let's just see, and this is a 1984 reprint, so yeah, 1984 I read that. Fantastic stuff, and I have read it since. So the science fiction aspect comes in because recently Penguin have published this book, Beautiful Star, which I will have shown you with a different livery in the introduction to the video with the theme tune and what have you. This is the Penguin Modern Classics UK first edition. What Penguin Modern Classics do with the prestigious books they haven't done before is they do them in this trade format, and it's the size of a demi. And here's another one they did about the year before that, Life for Sale, and they come in wraps like that, which is very, very pretty, very, very nice. And then a year later they do them in a standard B format. They do them in that format. So as I say, you will have seen the current cover, and it's interesting because Penguin have gone for a different look. They haven't put it into the standard Penguin Modern Classics livery, and that's quite interesting. We'll come back to that. So this is an SF novel, so that's the first edition. You very rarely get Penguin Modern Classics in hardcovers. They're always reissues. They've only ever done a few. They occasionally do them at Christmas. They're not usually the sort of books that I want to read, but it's a shame because I love it. It's the most important reissue imprint in the world, Penguin Classics and Penguin Modern Classics. You cannot go wrong. So I was intrigued, being a Mishima fan, to see this coming out, first time ever in English, and it's a science fiction novel. So I'm going to review it, but try and put it in the context of his other books as well, so you get an idea. And I would say anybody who is interested in great writing is interested in very, very unusual figures, outsider figures from the world of literature. And there is an outsider writing strand on the channel, which I've rather neglected of late. And Mishima really was an outsider, as you'll hear. And the man really, he was quite unpleasant in lots of ways. He was undeniably very clever, obviously very divided about things, and I'm going to talk about him a bit as well. There is another video on the channel which is in my rock and roll thread. It's Reading List Rock, and I talk about how the song comes up in this album and its relation to Mishima there, so you can look at that. I'll stick that in as a link at the end. So Penguin recently, after many, many years, there was no new Mishima for years, and there are still things untranslated and unissued. He, as I say, was born in 1925, he died in 1970. He was on the shortlist for the Nobel Prize 3 times, and the reason that he didn't win was because what used to happen with the Nobel is changing a bit now, and that's the Nobel Prize for Literature, which is for a body of work or for a lifetime, not one book, is that they would, the Nobel Committee in Sweden would tend to wait until somebody was really old and virtually on their deathbed before giving the award. So it was for the body of work. And it was one of those things where they thought, well, it's time for an Oriental novelist. And Mishima got knocked back a few times because he was still quite young, and they thought he's got years in him yet and he'll do some more fantastic work. So it didn't happen, and his death intervened. So we'll come to that. So he would have won the Nobel Prize. So that's important stuff. So Beautiful Stars just come out. To put his work into context, a good place to start reading Mishima is Confessions of a Mask. This is basically an autobiographical novel about him growing up. Now, Mishima was a high achiever academically. He was gay. He did have a wife and children for appearance's sake. And I would sum Mishima up by saying that his life and work typified the tension between the old feudal pre-war Japan and the rapid modernization of post-war Japan after the bombs fell, after the Americans moved in to help rebuild, and the way that Japan went from being this imperial old school society then straight into hyper-modernity, and then they led the world. They become fantastic engineers, scientists, what have you, and they've got this incredible culture. And I think that a lot of us in the West are fascinated by the clash of the ancient traditions and the sort of almost classical calm of Japanese culture up against its militarism and things like Bushido and samurai, and its exclusionist way of looking at things, and then its hyper-modernity. I mean, there's a song by Ultravox from the Vienna album called Western Promise, and it's all about that, and it really is fascinating stuff. And I think that combination of those two things clashing is what makes Japanese culture particularly so fascinating to Westerners. And the Japanese have been very influenced culturally in the modern and postmodern period by Western arts, by rock and roll, by literature, by film, what have you. And of course in SF, dystopian Japan, the dystopian Japan of cyberpunk narratives is a really important thing. So we are fascinated by that. I'd love to go there one day. So this is a good place to start. It's an autobiographical novel. Now, as I say, he was a high achiever, and back in the early 90s when I was dealing with Peter Owen, his UK hardcover publisher, and Peter would publish them, and this started happening in the 50s, and he would license them to Penguin. I was at Peter's office one day, which I think was Kenway Road, and I sat in his office and Peter let me read some of Mishima's handwritten letters in English to him about publishing and writing matters, and it was quite something because his handwriting was beautiful. And even though the subject of the letters was the business side of things, I mean, he could write, wow, he could write English like a native. And there is film of him speaking English. There's a great Arena documentary about Mishima, and that includes some interviews with Henry Scott Stokes, who wrote the definitive biography, The Life and Death of Yukio Mishima, which I don't have anymore. It's a great book. Let's try and get a copy. I think it's out of print, but you know, you can find it. So if you want to read that. And the thing with Mishima, he was fascinated by this idea of beauty in death, in dying young, and the sort of sanctity of the body. And he wrote a book about Hagakure, the samurai code of ethics, which is very similar to the way the Spartans were back in the classical period, where the men stayed separate from the women and they had relationships, and they were this Spartan military race of supermen. You know, they were sort of very much against weakness. The thing is, Mishima wasn't that strong, and he wanted to, in World War II, he wanted to become a kamikaze, and he bottled out the last minute, and he thought that dying for the imperial culture would be the ultimate glory, and he sort of recanted, and he sort of regretted it all his life. And I think that made him very angry and unhappy and uncertain about where he was going. So you see this enormous amount of self-loathing in this book, with this celebration of death and night and blood, which is a quotation from this book, and his homoerotic fantasies around the body. So he's a very deeply conflicted individual. He had a very visceral mind. His mind and his body were two different things. He believed in all this sort of right-wing stuff, but he was an intellectual as well, and he was very influenced by people like Dostoevsky, Hampson, and, you know, sort of Western existentialism. So there was this real conflict. So he embodies the way that Japan changed from the beginning of the war right the way through till the post-nuclear period. Just fascinating stuff. So he's an interesting writer to read if you read Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Castle, and I would recommend reading some of his work alongside that. It's fascinating stuff. Now, Japanese literature is really popular in the UK, has been for a long time. It's more popular than ever. Korean literature is popular. I do have a friend who's great on Korean literature. I'm going to get it to come on the channel, but she's shy, but maybe that will happen. So yeah, start with this one, and it's great, great stuff. And it really, really is quite sort of hard work. The average Mishima story, and it's hard to explain because there were certain sort of paradigms his work would fall into, and we see them time and again. And also there were atypical works, and not all his work has been translated yet. So, but really the usual Mishima story or novel, and he wrote plays as well, would be one of those things where there would be an enormous amount of delicacy and tradition and representation of Japanese life, and characters would interact, and there would always be at least one really malignant character who wanted to undermine everybody else and be really cruel to them and pitiless, and yet at the same time there's a kind of tenderness, and you see these interactions between the characters, and they're beautifully expressed and plangent and lucid. And even though there's different translators involved, Mishima's core strength as a writer of being able to use a wonderful wide vocabulary without it ever feeling clumsy or clustered or tripping you over is always there. And that's in every book and every story I've read by him. It's really quite something. It's really compulsive quality. And he does, to me, the reason I like him as an artist is I do like the visceral mind. I like artists for whom the brains and the guts are the same thing, and how, you know, you can't be an intellectual and stand back from this. You have to recognize the viscera and the body, the senses, and the living part of being a human being, of being corporeal as well as intellectual. So that's what really turns me on about Mishima. Fantastic stuff. And of course, when you read him as a young person or as a teenager, if you're an outsider, you do tend to relate to him. So as I say, you get these very sort of tender interactions between people, and then often there's a sudden act of violence at the end. And, you know, and that's the Mishima formula as much as there is one. Another great one to read early on, and one of my favourite books by him, is The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. And these are all pretty much in print. I think some of these are out of print. I will try and pop up which ones are not. This is a great one to read. It's a very short novel. There was a film made of it in late 60s, early 70s, which was very controversial at the time because it had some softcore love scenes in it between Sarah Miles and Chris Christopherson. And it's not a very good film because they transported it from Japan to coastal California, and it kind of lost something. And the basic thing in this is about a young lad whose father is dead, and he lives with his mother, and his mother forms this relationship with a sailor, and the young boy doesn't really approve, and he's formed this secret society with friends, so they all have numbers, and they're all full of ire and unhappy about things. and they're going to form the society, and they have sort of titles like number 3, and Noburo, I think, is the is number 3, and he, you know, they do terrible things. There's a really awful sort of sequence here where they torture a cat, and it's really not very pleasant. So I'm giving you that, as I don't do trigger warnings, but you know, this is fiction, remember, it's not reality, it's fiction, and often things are metaphoric, and it builds towards this terrible act of violence. But there is all this sort of dance of Japanese representation, and we do romanticize it a bit in the West, but it is absolutely fantastic. It is that balance, and I absolutely love this, so I would recommend that one. Another typical Mishima, I'm not sure if this is in print, and they do come and go, Temple of the Golden Pavilion. This was dramatized in a film called Mishima, A Life in 4 Acts, back in the 80s. It's a bit of a long film, I'm not that fussed on it, and it looks at his life, but it is interspersed with a dramatic narrative, which is this. And Temple of the Golden Pavilion is about a Buddhist student, a Buddhist, and he isn't really very happy with things, and he is obsessed with this building, the Golden Pavilion, and again it builds to a frightening act of violence. It's great stuff. So it's another fairly typical sort of Mishima there. Another typical Mishima is Thirst for Love, which is nice and brief, and I'm not sure if that's in print. And again, this is about a relationship which again builds to a horrible act of violence. And you could, you know, I have joked with the Mishima thing, you get all this tender interplay, then suddenly somebody gets their head cut off, and that's the end of the story. This is probably one of the most typical ones. There's a lot of sort of passion and intensity and boiling sort of fear and lust and angst, so it really is great stuff. One of the most famous Mishima books is this one, Forbidden Colours, and you might know the song Forbidden Colours by David Sylvian and Ryuichi Sakamoto. Ryuichi Sakamoto, of course, is in Yellow Magic Orchestra, and was he in Sadistic Microband? No, I don't think he was. I think that was Yukihiro Takahashi, the drummer. And Sylvian and Sakamoto did a version of this, and it was in the film Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, which featured David Bowie and Sakamoto. Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence was based on The Seed and the Sower, a novel about a Japanese prison camp by Lawrence van der Post. And I once heard Lawrence van der Post speak at a book selling conference, and he was just amazing. He's virtually forgotten now. Travel writer, novelist. He's long dead. Used to write a lot about Africa, and he just gave this amazing speech about storytelling, and he got a standing ovation from a room full of bookshop managers, and I tell you, that doesn't happen. He's really quite something. Seed and the Sower, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, good film, and the song Forbidden Colours. Sylvian re-recorded it on Secrets of the Beehive, his third album, in a slightly different form, and it seems to be about religion and faith and Christianity, but this is about a guy who is obsessed with revenge after a number of broken marriages, and he sort of comes across this beautiful young male athlete, and he thinks, this is somebody I can totally destroy. So that's what these narratives are like, you know, they are quite something. So there's a certain vileness about them, but they're very bracing and compelling reading, so you must go for it and give them a try. Recently reissued in a penguin cloth bound, the mini cloth bounds, and I'll flash one on the screen because I haven't bought one yet, is Death and Midsummer and Other Stories, which is a really good collection of various Mishima stories and a play, because he wrote lots of plays, give you an idea and insight into the breadth of the man's work. Some typical things, some untypical things. Very, very good indeed. Just to sort of show that it wasn't all like that with Yukio. It wasn't all that sort of stuff. He did all kinds of other things. This, for example, I used to have a different edition of this. This is the current vintage edition, and I'm normally not a big fan of vintage. I think they throw their books together. They've got a great backlist, but they don't make a lot of effort. I quite like the cover of this one. And this is The Sound of Waves, which is a very tender love story and beautiful. It's very simple. It takes place in a fishing village on an island in coastal Japan. I absolutely lovely. You know, it's a really charming read, and I do really like that one. And it's atypical, and it sort of shows the breadth of his talent. He wasn't just this obsessive nut all the time. So Sound of Waves is great. And funnily enough, again, the Sound of Waves is an instrumental by Mick Karn, who, it was a B-side of a single called Sensitive, and the sound, I think it's on Mick Karn's first album, Titles, as well. And Mick Karn was the bass player and saxophonist in the band Japan with David Sylvian, who I mentioned a bit earlier on. Maybe I'll flash all these records up on the screen as well. So you can see there's interactions between musicians and Mishima, and the work around which spreads out into other artists like Van der Post, Sakamoto. Fascinating stuff. So it just goes to show great rock and roll has a reading list with it. And yeah, Sound of Waves, really lovely book, charming. You know, so if you want to sort of have the gentler side of Japan in that period, I really recommend this. It's absolutely beautiful, and the prose, just the silveriness, the descriptive quality, and the sheer elegance and eloquence of Mishima's prose can't be underestimated. You know, you can see it, and the characterization is there, the descriptions are there. Absolutely stunning stuff. It really is some of the best writing I've ever read. Now, at the moment, if you wanted to sort of pick some other things up, Life for Sale, I say, has been issued. That's now in a standard Penguin Modern Classics livery. And just before that, I've not read that one yet. I started to read it to get a feel for it, because I'm keeping them back, because there hasn't been any new Mishima for years and years and years. Then 3 years we've had 3. And also this one popped up, Frolic of the Beasts as well. And that's the standard Penguin Modern Classics livery. So Life for Sale, that was the first, and now it'll look rather like this. So those have come up recently. So if you're an old school Mishima fan and you haven't read any for years, these have popped up, which is good. What I don't have, and I sold it to my eternal regret, I did have a hardcover Sekka edition of the 4 volumes in Mishima's final work, the Sea of Fertility trilogy, and I used to have a really big Royal Format Penguin Modern Classic event. I sold both of them on, and the last one of those, the 4th book in that series, The Decay the Angel, is the one that Matt read at Book Build recently, and I know he loved it. Just one more little weird thing to show you before I do the review, and this is a little mini book of Star by Yukio. There we go. And interestingly, even though he was this big literary figure, he would write the odd potboiler to make some money. And, you know, say plays, poetry, novels, stories. He also appeared in films. Several of his books were made into films. He was into bodybuilding and leather, and you'll see pictures of him posing with a leather jacket by a motorbike. And, you know, he was obsessed with this sort of slightly queer aesthetic around biking and leathers and what have you. And he even appeared in a musical film where he sings. It's utterly bizarre. He was, again, this thing about the traditional and the modern, it sort of all embodied himself in him, and he was half in love with it and half hating it. And that's why he's such an interesting man. But he really wanted to see Japan go back to the old school and bring the empire back and reject all the modernity and remain exclusionist. And what he did late in his life, when he was writing the Sea of Fertility tetralogy, and he was married then, respectably, had kids, he formed this little private right-wing army, this little militia. And in 1970, the morning that he completed the final book in the tetralogy, he put it down, he went for a meeting with the guys, and they stormed a Japanese government building, and they attempted to get a coup and a rebellion going, which failed. And there is film of him speaking from the top of the building, and the coup failed, and then Mishima basically committed harikiri. He took the sword, put it into his side, twisted it, but he bungled it, and his gay lover, who was part of the militia, then decapitated him to finish the job. And there are photographs and everything is quite something. So it's a very sensationalistic thing. So he is fascinating, and in some ways it would be better not to know this when you read the work, but when you do, it does really sort of bring into sort of focus what his work was about. So when he does something which is atypical, it's really interesting. And Beautiful Star, like The Sound of Waves is a more untypical book. So these are the most challenging ones in a funny sort of way. And it's really, really interesting to have read this the last few days. So just so you know, if you want to get Confessions of a Mask, there is a really nice current Peter Owen edition, which I don't have because I've had this for years and it's signed by Peter, as I say. And it got reissued in this livery. Peter Owen is now dead. The imprint's owned by a different firm who are doing a great job. And they did a set of 4 of these. This is Tajay Versas, The Ice Palace, which Graham and I have mentioned. They do it with a die cut. And I think these are gone now. And then they've reissued them without a die cut. I can't stand die cuts in jackets. This is the up-to-date version of that. And they've done the Confessions of the Mask just like this, red. Really nice. So, but as I've got 2 copies, I don't think I justify a third. Mind you, I've got 3 copies of this. So there you go. But I'll talk about that again. And me and Graham have talked about it, I think, in one of the Grumpy Old Men things. Amazing literary fantasy novel. Is it a fantasy novel? You could argue that, but it's amazing anyway. Another guy who should have won the Nobel and didn't, Versas, didn't win it because he died too young. So, moving on to Beautiful Star. Well, with all that background knowledge and with my expectations and what I'm used to with Yukio, this was quite strange because when it was first announced, I thought, a science fiction novel by Yukio Mishima? I'm a little bit skeptical. Is it really an SF novel? Or is it like the kind of thing that John Blackburn used to do, where it would have an SF conceit and would appear to be SF, and then as you got to the end of the plot, it would be revealed that it wasn't SF? Another thought that I had when I first read a descriptor of it, before the book was published, in a catalogue or online, was that the way the plot was described was that it seemed rather sort of soft and jokey, and I thought really this might not be an SF novel. This is going to be a fabulation where Yukio was playing with the stuff of SF, and in it he's going to poke a bit of fun of it and what have you. And we will talk about Japanese SF a bit later on in the year, because I'm doing some reading and rereading and reading a book which I read a long time ago about the subject, and also reading some stuff I haven't read and revisiting some other things. But I thought this isn't going to be a real SF novel, and what I will say, without giving spoilers, is that it is a real SF novel. Only just, but it is. And it's very, very beautifully written. It's an interesting translation. It's described in the wrap as being a sort of gentle black comedy. It's also described as being something that he thought was his masterpiece. Now, I don't know what the actual evidence for this is, and I've not researched it, but as I understood it, I think he felt that the final tetralogy was his masterpiece, which was why he went ahead with a coup, which he pretty much knew would fail and would end with his sort of honourable seppuku, suicide death. So I'm not so certain about that, and I find it hard to believe. Anyway, I'll talk to you a little bit about the plot. There's a family, a mum and dad and 2 kids, and they're teenagers, and independently, all of them have seen flying saucers. They've had flying saucer encounters. This was published 62-63. And so the flying saucer phenomenon, which became a big thing in 1947 and was talked about a lot in the 50s, then, you know, they sort of encountered that. And the good thing about this is this does refer a lot to classic UFO literature, people like Major Donald Kehoe, and it talks about the real things, you know, the stuff that was happening at the time, and the books about it particularly. And these 4 individuals in this family, they're quite sort of lower middle class, they're quite comfortable, they sort of standoffish, and it begins with them going on this little trek in the night, climbing a mountain to try and spot some UFOs, and they've each seen them individually. And what they've all realized in their individual sightings is that even though they're a family, they're all from other planets and they're living in human bodies. And it does come across as slightly whimsical, but because of the sheer silken, shimmering gorgeousness of the writing, it's like as soft as the nylon of a stocking. It really, really is quite something. And you get this beautiful narrative, and they walk up and they spot the flying saucers, and they're always turning from green to apricot. And, you know, the translation is really good, you know, and you get that thing. But it is a lot softer and lighter in lots of ways in other Mishima narratives. And you see the characters developing, And typically in a sort of conservative style, the mother is the one you see the less of. The father's the most prominent. The daughter, who is described as being stunningly beautiful, and the way that Mishima describes her is, you know, absolutely fantastic. It really is quite something. And they each have their own characters which they think represent the planets they're actually from. And they decide they're going to sort of save humanity from the threat of nuclear war by promoting peace. And the father gets a lecture to it together and goes from there. However, there is another cabal of people who also believe they're aliens, and they are more typical of Mishima's compelled, compulsive, damaged, deadly and bad to know characters. And they think that the only way to save humanity is by destroying it because it's vile. And they decide that they're from a star in Cygnus, and that they are going to encourage humanity to somehow push the nuclear button. So obviously in Japan is the only place where atomic bombs were ever used, and obviously that had a massive impact, and that concerned the Japanese people. They became very peaceful. Mishima, of course, was all for militarism, interestingly enough. And a big part of the book towards the end is taken up with a dialogue between these different factions, and there's a lot of philosophy and mouthpiecing. And it's very, very hard sometimes to pick out which is Mishima's, though going by the other books you can tell which one it is, the most nihilistic side. But it does come to a conclusion which proves it's an SF novel. Did I like it? Well, I will say I don't like it as much as some of his more typical books, but it was a real surprise. It was very interesting. The writing, absolutely marvellous. I did feel it was a little bit too didactic and preachy, especially in the philosophical part, and you think, well, in a way we want some more action. But, you know, part of the thing about reading intellectuals is you've got to let them have their head with this sort of thing. And I did enjoy it. There's a film of it, apparently. I imagine that's quite whimsical. And it trod a very interesting line between whimsicality and harshness. It was fascinating, and it's the first new Mishima I've read for decades, absolute decades. So it's kind of primed me now to read. I think I read Star a while ago. This came out a few years ago, and they did like a little the Penguin Modern series, and most of them didn't have pictorial covers. That was to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Modern Classics, and they're sort of all out of print now, pretty much. There's the odd one now and again you'll see. So I've got Frolic of the Beasts and Life Itself to read, which I might read soon, we'll see, because that's sort of given me a taste again. I think Penguin are hoping that Beautiful Star is going to become one of these little culty oriental books which get picked up by a lot of young people, and that they suddenly go boom and explode and they go on TikTok and what have you. I'm not certain that's going to happen, but I do think it will charm a lot of people. As an adjunct to that, I'm going to talk briefly about this book, Osamu Dazai's A Shameful Life, which this edition came out, let's see, this is from Stonebridge Press, and this came out, let's have a look, 2018, and this was reprinted every year since then. It was first published in 1948, and Osamu Dazai is kind of a precursor of Mishima. I read a book by him way back in the 80s called Travels of the Purple Tramp, which was sort of like an autobiographical thing, and he committed suicide too. He walked into a river and drowned himself, and he's often seen as a precursor of Mishima, probably just for that reason. And he wrote really well as well. He was great. And this was made into a manga by, is it Jushi? I can't remember the guy's name. He's huge in Japan. I'm not a manga guy, even though I sell loads in work. And it was called Less Than Human, or No Longer Human. I'll put the correct title up. And that, in a new Directions edition, has been really popular with young people in the last couple of years. It's got exactly the same text as this. This is still in print, so I'm not quite sure how that's happened. So maybe this is Californian, so maybe it's a rights territory thing. And it is really good, and it's the story of a young man who's alienated and depressed. And you know, it really strikes a chord with young people who are struggling with their identity and things. And it's you know, he can't understand the world and doesn't fit in. Classic existentialist outsider thing, and that's become really big through this massive manga adaptation and then the novel. And another Osamu Dazai has been reissued recently. So that's great stuff, and people are reading it. It's really, really good. So I suspect Penguin might be thinking that if they produce this in a non-modern classics livery, make it look more accessible, as you will have seen it does, that it might sort of take off as this does. So, but you know, this is good as well. So do read this, it's great stuff. So there's a little look at Yukio Mishima, his life, his work, and a little review of Beautiful Star. If you haven't read him, I would say he's essential for everybody, really. The keynote books I would focus on are Confessions of a Mask and the very, very wonderful Sailor Who Fell from Grace of the Sea, and that's a beautiful one as well. But I found all his work worth reading. So this is Outlaw Bookseller, signing out for now. Hope you enjoy it. Banzai. Or is it origato? Origato is the only Japanese word I know, and also listening to lots of rock bands doing live in Japan albums means thank you. So origato for watching. Bye for now.